Welcome to the inaugural session of the Los Altos Institution's Global Security Speaker Series. Our guest today is Mr. Max Abrahms, professor at Northeastern University, advisor to both the CIA and Amazon, and an internationally recognized commentator on counter-terrorism and U.S. foreign policy. In this conversation, he will analyze Washington's approach to the Middle East, with particular attention to the fast-moving Israel-Iran conflict and terrorism in general. Let's start with the hottest topic that has dominated the headlines over the past few weeks: the Iran-Israel escalation. The key question is, why now? Netanyahu has been saying for the past 30 years that Iran is close to a nuclear bomb. Do you really buy into this theory of a nuclear bomb? And do you think the signed ceasefire will last?
These are good questions. The, there are a lot of people who have been opposed to um, kinetic operations inside of Iran. And one of the arguments has been, well, why now? Particularly because Netanyahu, has sort of notoriously been known for advocating a military approach to Iran by warning for many, many years now of Iran's nuclear program. And it can seem certainly today in 2025 that his warnings were incorrect because even to this day, currently, it's believed that actually Iran does not have a serviceable nuclear weapon. Couple responses to that. One is that Israel actually has been actively interfering in the development of an Iranian nuclear program. And that's been going on for many years now. And so the fact that it didn't materialize doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't a genuine threat of Iran developing a nuclear weapon. It's precisely because of that fear that Israel has worked to sabotage, the development of a nuclear weapon. A lot of critics have compared the intervention in Iran to the 2003 Iraq War, where the George W. Bush administration famously lied, really, or I won't say, at the very least, we know that they got wrong the reports that Iraq had all sorts of WMD, right? Let's just leave it at that. That we were told that there were WMD in all sorts of ways, and that proved to be basically substantively wrong. However, with respect to the situation with Iran, it's not nearly as speculative. The evidentiary basis of Iran developing a nuclear weapon is incontrovertible. So we know this even based on the IAEA. We know that Iran has had uranium enriched at 60%. There's no country in the world which doesn't have a nuclear weapon which has uranium enriched at that level. Iran was also offered to maintain a nuclear program for civilian purposes, but refused to give up its enrichment. So the fact that the United States got it wrong with respect to WMD in 2003 really isn't actually any kind of real evidence that it's wrong today for a different country. Nobody serious disputes that Iran um, has been developing nuclear weapons capability, right? So that really does go a long way, I think, in terms of explaining the timing, even if there have been apparent misstatements before in the past, both by the Israelis as well as the Americans.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that gave a good overview about does Iran actually have a nuclear bomb? Could you address the second part of my question, which was, do you think the ceasefire will last, which has been signed a few days ago?
The thing is, just going back, I'm not actually saying that Iran currently has nuclear weapons, but the real difficulty, of course, for making a bomb is the enrichment of the uranium. And we know that it's not disputed that Iran has been enriching uranium in a very dangerous way. And if Iran wanted to, it could cross that threshold to the point where its enriched uranium would be essentially bomb ready within a couple weeks. And that sort of nuance with the science, and I'm not, clearly I'm not a nuclear scientist, but that sort of nuance allows different people, depending on their politics, to frame the situation in different ways. Those who are in favor of intervention would say, look, they basically have the stuff for a nuclear weapon and could dash ahead and use it, within literally a couple weeks. Whereas other people could say, there's no evidence that Iran has a nuclear weapon now, and that it's not necessarily weaponizing that in the sense that it's not actually taking the enriched uranium and attaching it physically to a weapon. But this is this is a dangerous situation. I personally have been happy with Donald Trump's position on Iran. I have advocated for it, and I think that he has picked the best path forward. There's some jokes now, some people are joking, some people are serious. Should Donald Trump get a Nobel Prize for his position on Iran? And honestly, I think that he should. I think that he should. I've been very happy about it. The way that I understand basically the decision tree as to what Donald Trump did and why I think it was so laudable is that he really began by pushing negotiations. He wasn't quick to involve the United States militarily in Iran. There were like 5 or 6 meetings with the American and Iranian negotiators where he tried to essentially resolve the Iranian nuclear threat without using US military force. And the position of Donald Trump, in my opinion, was reasonable. That you could use nuclear power, but you can't have a nuclear weapons program. And that requires not enriching uranium. But the Iranian leadership said that that was a no-go. Even on the very day that the US was attacking the Iranian nuclear facilities, the president of Iran on that exact day said that Iran will never surrender nuclear uranium enrichment. So he started off from a negotiating posture. And then there were all sorts of camps supplying advice to Donald Trump. The so-called realist camp, and those who have read some about the study of international relations will know of the realist camp. People like the most well-known academic who's a realist is Professor John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago. And they opposed the U.S. attacking the Iran in any way. John Mearsheimer actually said that if Iran develops a nuclear weapon, it will be good. It will be good for international peace and security, as well as maybe even good for the United States. And so there were realists have tended to say the United States shouldn't intervene. Also, some people on the left wouldn't want the United States intervening, but also, kind of interestingly, MAGA isolationists. These are people who voted for Donald Trump, but oppose U.S. Military intervention in Iran. So there's that camp made up of a group of different people, intellectually and politically. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, there are, so-called neocons, neoconservatives, and they favored a U.S. intervention where the goals were really quite expansive, where the goals were not only to strike the nuclear sites, but also to topple the Iranian leadership. Donald Trump, he gave negotiations a chance and actually rejected both of these two camps and instead authorized strikes on 3 Iranian nuclear facilities. Based on what we know, they were direct hits. And then the B-2 bombers flew home. There wasn't a huge, messy regime change. There's no sort of civil war that the United States contributed to or is responsible for. There's no effort for the United States to externally impose on a foreign country our own notion as to who the government should be. For the sake of U.S. national security, he authorized attacks against these sites, and I think that he handled the matters very well. And then he really pushed for a ceasefire. Now, I'm not going to say, that I have utmost confidence that the ceasefire will hold. It's never a good idea to bet on long-term peace in the Middle East. But at the time of this recording, the ceasefire is holding. And that was not easy to achieve. One of the reasons why Trump has been able to achieve it, at least for the moment, is because he is seen by Israel as a supporter. And Israel, even after the ceasefire was announced, wanted to keep going. Apparently, there were 52 Israeli, military planes in the sky with a full target package to attack, because Israel wanted to continue to attrit Iranian military capability. Yes, in terms of nuclear weapons development, but other capability, for example, missile launchers, missiles, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps targets nuclear scientists. And Donald Trump was very proud of this ceasefire that he was able to orchestrate, and he didn't want Israel to ruin it. And so he called up Netanyahu and said, look, you better call off those strikes. This ceasefire applies to Iran, it applies to Israel, and so far it has held. So I think that Trump really does deserve all the credit in the world. There's currently a debate as to the extent of the damage to those nuclear facilities. And I think it's clearly premature to say with any certainty what the exact damage is. But I will say that I am skeptical of the ongoing media reports that have been shown and circulated through the Washington Post and the New York Times and CNN, which are saying that actually Iran remains very close to developing nuclear weapons if Iran chooses to do so. I'm skeptical because there is a lot of disinformation in this world. A lot of things have been said about Trump and the Biden administration, which we now know was false. And I think that for a real sort of, battle damage estimate assessment, there will need to be individuals on the ground looking through the wreckage in terms of what has survived. But Trump authorized 14 30,000-pound bunker busters. And if you look at the visuals, you can see that the holes as to where they impacted, or, they really struck exactly where we wanted them to go. And I am more inclined to believe Donald Trump, Hegseth, the head of the IAEA, as well as Israeli intelligence, which are all saying that the damage is rather substantial. And the final thing that I'll say is that even in the event that for whatever reason, kind of in defiance of scientific expectations, that a lot of the centrifuges and fissile material somehow managed to survive. What the Trump administration is saying now is that if it does find evidence that Iran is reconstituting the program, the United States could do a do-over. The United under Trump, there could be more attacks, and so for those who are concerned about Iran developing nuclear weapons, we're in much better shape now than we were just a week ago.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for that. I think you gave a good overview about President Trump and his views on this matter. Just tying into that question, what really changed Donald Trump's mind, given that ex-National Security Advisor Mike Waltz was sacked due to his advocacy for the Israeli attack on Iran? So, what changed between him sacking Mike Waltz and now that he himself is advocating for attacks on Iran?
Well, I don't really see a big discontinuity. If you look at the span of Donald Trump's life in politics, he wrote a book in 2011 where he said that Iran cannot get nuclear weapons. Trump famously opposed the Iran nuclear deal under Obama, the so-called JCPOA, because its critics believe that it would have led to an Iranian nuclear bomb. And so the fact that he pursued negotiations, but Iran rejected them in terms of refusing to abandon uranium enrichment, um, I think that the United States ended up in a natural place, which was to strike the nuclear facilities.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for that. I think the next question ties into more like if a change of regime happens in Iran, what will be the implications to Iran's proxy network, like the Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and the Kataib Hezbollah forces in Iraq, and to the general Shia community across the Middle East? What will be the implications if the Iranian regime does end up changing after these attacks?
The thing is that when it's very easy to identify governments that the United States doesn't like around the world. And it's actually easy given the United States' superb military. It's also very easy for the United States to topple foreign governments. Um, the U.S. military just has so many options available to it, but it is extremely difficult, even impossible, to predict what will replace the government that you topple. And so, for that reason, almost without exception, I would oppose regime change operations. It would have to be, for me to support a regime change, it would have, and I honestly cannot think of a contemporary example, so that's why I don't advocate regime change. But theoretically, it would have to be a regime where I literally could not imagine a worse replacement. So, like, I think of like Adolf Hitler or something. Certainly, I would support regime change in that situation because I simply cannot fathom a worse replacement. Um, but that's a very unusual circumstance, which hasn't repeated itself um, in my memory,
Yeah.
in my living memory. And so, you topple the government in Tehran, and what happens next? The truth is, nobody knows. And what could also happen is that there could not even be like a clean replacement. It could just be a warring situation of sort of aspiring political entrepreneurs with a weakened Iranian government. It could result, I mean, theoretically, in in a civil war, even in a genocide. Um, it is possible that weapons would be spewed all over the place into the hands of even more unreliable actors. Um, so for that reason, it's a very dangerous and dirty game to play, and I don't get involved in that. So although I was a big advocate of Trump striking the nuclear sites, my advice has been to restrict the attacks to those nuclear sites, and that is exactly what the U.S. military did. Um, in terms of the effects on the Iranian terrorist proxies, the Iran has a very special security configuration, which makes it different than any other country in the world. where it has relied very heavily on, it's called all sorts of things. Sometimes it's called the axis of resistance. Sometimes it's called the ring of fire. And, although when we look at the Iran war, Trump likes to say that it's a 12-day war. And in some ways it is, but in some ways you could go, way before those 12 days to begin the war. You might say that the war started on October 7th, 2023, when Hamas carried out Operation Al-Aqsa Flood in Israel, because Hamas is sponsored by foreign countries, including Iran. And Israel has done quite a number on the military capabilities of Hamas. And Hezbollah also then declared war on Israel. And Israel then did quite a number against Hezbollah. And because Hezbollah was so degraded militarily, that contributed to the fall of Assad in Syria, because Assad and Hezbollah are allies. And historically, Hezbollah has helped Assad to stay in power. According to the so-called rebels, or whatever you want to call them, in Syria, they timed their attack on Aleppo and then moving towards Damascus right after Hezbollah was substantially degraded. That's what the so-called rebels themselves say. And we know that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu began planning the strikes in Iran immediately after the leader of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, was taken out, and that campaign in Lebanon. And without understanding this axis of resistance and the ring of fire, you can't really understand the war in Iran, because in Iran's military thinking, it was never going to be fighting against Israel without very active terrorist proxies. The thinking was that Iran would green light these terrorist proxies to launch attacks against Israel, punishing Israel, especially in northern Israel, with Hezbollah rockets. But once Hamas and Hezbollah, and then with the fall of Assad, and even the weakening of the IRGC inside of Syria, all of that created a much more viable path for Israel to punish Iran without having to worry about Iran's terrorist proxies just shooting off all of the time. What Israel was able to restrict its sort of defensive focus to ballistic missile strikes from Iran. So it is very important to understand the relationship between Iran's conventional military and, these terrorist proxies. So I can't really say for sure what the effect will be of the 12-day war on the terrorist proxies, but what I've tried to do is explain what the effect of the counterterrorism operations against those terrorist proxies have meant for the 12-day war, if you will.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that was really insightful for everyone watching about the proxies. Moving on to so we've always seen there's been a villain in the geopolitical in the mix, and Iran was that villain in the Middle East, bringing opponents like Israel and Saudi Arabia together. What happens if the Iranian regime changes, and will the other Middle Eastern countries be able to justify the Abraham Accords and the friendship with Israel to its masses?
You know, in the past like couple days or so, I've seen some reports indicating that maybe the Abraham Accords will be expanded. That there is some talk now of including Lebanon and even Syria, which is really quite a remarkable development. And of course, is only being discussed because of the toppling of Assad. Um, I think that there are sort of cross-cutting effects in terms of how the last like week or two will affect the Abraham Accords. On the one hand, I think that Israel's military performance was really quite exceptional in Iran, and that might, you know, hint towards a more robust Abraham Accords where more Arab countries would want to have a even bigger formal relationship with Israel. But on the other hand, the Abraham Accords really are a form of counterbalancing against Iran. And so, because Israel was so successful militarily against, against Iran, and Iran is now weaker militarily, ironically, that may undercut the strategic logic of the Abraham Accords because Iran, in a way, showed itself to be a paper tiger. So we'll see. I would like to see the Abraham Accords expand, but again, their main goal was to contain Iran. And Iran hopefully will be more contained now, given the relative weakness of the terrorist proxies, as well as Iran's weak showing in, conventionally, where, for example, Iran didn't even fire any shots at all, apparently, against the B-2s. Israel dominated Iranian airspace within 48 hours. I've seen reports that something like 65% of Iranian missile launchers have been taken out. Iran's the number of missiles that it currently has is also way down. So for all of those reasons, I think the urgency of an expanded Abraham Accords has actually gone down as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think moving back to the United States involvement in the Middle East, we've seen that U.S. foreign policy has in the Middle East has thrived on conflict. If a U.S. aligned leader is installed or gets appointed in Iran, what changes do you think like what can we anticipate in the way that U.S. would approach the Middle East in general?
I really don't even like to comment because I don't want my comments to be misconstrued as my supporting regime change. Whenever people start talking about who should be the leadership or how can we weaken the government, I just really don't want any part of that. I did support actually the Iraq War. I was young. I had just gotten a master's degree at Oxford. I was the youngest fellow at a think tank called the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And everybody in DC at the time that I was exposed to in the State Department, in the Defense Department, uh, Democrats, Republicans were telling me that essentially regime change would go swimmingly, that we would be greeted as liberators, that the United States would promote democracy, not only in Iraq, but that it would expand throughout the region into Syria, and none of that happened. And then I watched, years later with Libya in terms of the toppling of Gaddafi, and he too, like Saddam Hussein, was a real despot. But a real argument could be made that the regime change operations were actually counterproductive, not just in terms of international security, but on a humanitarian level on the ground in those countries. And so I don't get into the regime change talk.
Okay. To move on to Asia with China, China gets 15% of its energy from Iran, and the whole Iran-China pipeline project is now threatened due to the conflict. What potential moves can China make in the Middle East to make up for this pipeline getting potentially damaged?
Well, China really did have a lot on the line with respect to the war with Iran because China is an enormous importer of Iranian oil. And it looked like um, one of the possible reprisal options was going to be shutting down, the waterways, which would have highly impacted Iran's ability to export oil. And so China is much more dependent on the oil from Iran than, say, the United States. So, but my understanding is that we're all good, really. That nothing in that area is going to be affected. I believe that Rubio Secretary of State Rubio was on the phone with his counterpart in China, basically saying we really don't want, um, Iran messing around with the waterways, and um, we're not trying to threaten um, the Iran's ability to export oil, which may have mollified any concerns by the Chinese. Some of the so-called MAGA isolationists who were opposed to the U.S. military intervention, people like Tucker Carlson, he said that if the U.S. intervened, that Iran would not be alone, that it would be supported basically in a military alliance by China and Russia and BRICS countries, and that the United States was essentially starting World War III. But luckily, the war didn't play out at all the way MAGA isolationists were warning, and Iran was very much isolated.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. We're gonna move on to like the last segment, which is like a question which is personal from my side. Most of us at our think tank at the Los Altos Institution are high schoolers and will attend college over the next few years. As a professor at a reputed university, I wanted to get your view on why some of the protests are happening on college campuses and what impact that has had on the overall academic environment. Also, why didn't such protests happen when hundreds of thousands of people were killed in Syria or Iraq or in Africa and Sudan when major conflicts did happen there?
That's a really good question. You know, On October 10th, I'll tell a story. On October 10th, 2023, so that's 3 days after the Hamas massacre in Israel. And just to put this in context, the the attack on October 7th was actually the second most lethal terrorist attack in world history on record, where the record begins in the late 1960s. If you go into like the global terrorism database, you'll see that that attack was not just highly lethal compared to previous attacks in Israel, but it actually ranks only behind the 9/11 terrorist attack. And so 3 days after it, some guy I never noticed before, never saw before, he came up to me. I was standing near my office, and he handed me a flyer for me to attend a pro Hamas event down the street in Cambridge. I'm a professor at Northeastern University, and he was trying to get me to go to this event, or at least let me know about it. So I thought that that was um, concerning, because you're really not supposed to hand out propaganda. He literally placed it in my hand. You're not supposed to do that right out, like it was in the hallway in front of my office. And it was only 3 days after what's called Operation Al-Aqsa Flood for me to attend a pro-Hamas event. But in any event, I took the flyer and put it in my office and headed out to class to teach a evening class where the topic was going to be on actually right-wing extremism and right-wing terrorism, the kind perpetrated by Timothy McVeigh in the mid 1990s. That was the topic of the course. But when I looked out at my students, and it was a seminar, so I knew most of my students. Or I knew the faces of all of them. I saw this same student in the classroom, and I approached him and said, what are you doing here? This is only open to the students enrolled in the class. And he said no, he was a student at Northeastern and he wasn't going to leave. He needed to monitor my classroom in order to ensure that anything that I said was in alignment with his views, especially his views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And he had his computer open, and I was pretty sure that he was going to be sort of hoping to maybe live tweet me, maybe to try to like swarm me. So I told him, no, you can't be in the classroom. We're not going to start. And he got quite animated, where he stood up and started marching around the class and saying, the United States and Northeastern and I, was complicit in genocide, and encouraged the students to walk out of the classroom to attend this pro-Hamas event. And my class was substantially delayed. And after that happened, I didn't file an immediate complaint against the student, but then he harassed me near my office. I'll just say it because it's okay. I just say it, but he went up to me really close and he says to me, "Happy fucking Thanksgiving," right? To my face. So then I was like, wow, this is something. He sent me like a aggressive email, and also there's another Jewish faculty member who was also harassed by this same student. Um, in both cases, we neither me nor my colleague were even teaching about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He just targeted us because we're Jewish professors at Northeastern. And my colleague said that he wrote a formal complaint against the student, and my colleague encouraged me to do the same. And so, separately, in totally separate incidents, we both filed complaints against this student for intimidation, for infringing on academic freedom. And I filled out all of the information. I supplied the photographs. I detailed the harassment. And I, on several occasions, called the investigative body connected to Northeastern University to get an update about the status of my complaint. Because for all I knew, this guy was going to show up at my house. So I wanted to know how it was going. And the university wouldn't update me. And then during the graduation ceremony, several months later, my phone started blowing up. And it started blowing up because the Northeastern graduation ceremony was taken over by a Antifada supporter who had like the fake blood on his hands and made a huge scene where the police, I think, had to escort this person off of the stage. And I started getting photographs of the event, and it was the very student who had taken over my classroom, who had harassed me and at least one other Jewish colleague. And I tell this story because I think it indirectly answers your question. Why do we see these extremist events on campus? And honestly, it has a lot to do with the weakness of the university leadership. The university was well aware that this student was a hazard, that he was in violation of numerous university rules, but they just acted very weakly. And they went ahead, presumably, and gave this guy his diploma. So a big part of the problem, I think the main part of the problem, the main thrust of the problem, is that the university at the leadership level has allowed extremism to get completely out of control. They could have easily have prevented this student not from humiliating the university by taking over the graduation ceremony. That's what I would have done. I think that's what most reasonable people have done. But the university leaderships have been extremely weak, and it has led to a lot of disgraceful events, infringements on academic freedom, and frankly, quite a bit of anti-Semitism.
Okay, time, Mr. Abrams, and thank you for letting us record this conversation. I think we had a really good and insightful conversation for all of our fellows.
I'm very impressed with this operation that you guys have set up, and I look forward to being in touch with you guys as you continue your ascent to be future leaders of U.S. national security and foreign policy.
Yep. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for the kind words for our fellows and researchers
Yeah,
as well.
you guys are the future leaders of this country. So I hope to see you around.
Thank you for joining us for the first speaker of the Global Security Speaker Series. We hope that Mr. Abrams' insights have deepened your understanding of the strategic choices of the United States in the Middle East. To stay informed about upcoming speaker series and other events, follow the Los Altos Institution on LinkedIn. Thank you.